Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Tonight, on our countdown to Halloween, we have another Rob Bowers story for you. This is from Rob's third book, called Campfire Tales from Uncle Rob, Volume 3, which will be released soon and will be available along with his other two books on Amazon. Enjoy as Clay Steele reads The Phantom Laugh.
Howdy, folks. How are you tonight? This is another good story from Rob Bowers. Sit back and enjoy this one. It's kind of fun. It's called The Phantom Laugh. Well, I used to fish some farm ponds with my buddy Leroy. Leroy, he had access to all the ponds on a huge ranch located north of Woodward, Oklahoma. For nearly all my life up to that point, I had heard stories about the farm ponds on this ranch. I was lucky enough to get to know Leroy, and luckier still to get to fish some of the ponds on that ranch. The ponds on this ranch were famous, almost legendary. I think this was because almost no one was able to fish them. Fishermen told stories about these ponds. The stories were mostly secondhand. Very few people I knew of had ever fished there. The stories were always about how big the ponds were and how big the fish were. The general consensus was, from all the tales that were being told about this place, that the ponds were big and deep and the fish were huge and plentiful, because there was no fishing pressure. I had always heard there was one particular pond on that ranch that was big enough to water ski on. That pond, it was big for sure, but not big enough to water ski on. Leroy and I had fished that pond many times. There didn't seem to be many fish in it. Now, not far away from the big pond was another pond that lived up to the stories and the hype. Now, this pond was down in a big canyon. You had to drive down a steeply inclined road to get to it. The pond had a bluff on one side, and the pond also had some trees in it. Some of those trees were pretty big. It had a feeder creek that ran into it on one end. It had cattails and brush around most of the shoreline. Behind the cattails and brush were a lot of trees. I should also mention there was only one way into this pond, and that was that steep road. The road flattened out at the bottom of the hill, where there was just a little turnaround area. The turnaround was handy for getting back out. I had a little two-man bass boat back then. I hauled it around in the back of my pickup truck. The little boat was just perfect for farm ponds. Leroy and I had been on this pond with my little boat 3 different times. We had caught some nice bass there. We also had our lines broken every time we were there. There was a specific location in the pond where we always had our lines broken. Near one end of the pond, there was a big tree, and 20 yards from the tree was a line of moss and weeds. The moss and the weeds extended back about 20 foot to the cattails. Behind the cattails was some big thick brush and then some trees again. All this cover extended down the canyon along the feeder creek. The big fish that broke our fishing lines were all hooked in this area. Most of the line breakers got into that thick moss and the weeds, or they got into tree limbs under the water. Now, after our third trip, Leroy and I both decided to try spooling our reels with spider wire. At that time, spider wire was a pretty new product. Spider wire was the first braided line that hit the market. At least it was the first braided line that we knew about. The line was braided Kevlar. 40-pound test spider wire was about the diameter of 5 or 6 pound test monofilament, and there is zero stretch to the line. It was early morning on the 4th day. Leroy and I visited the pond with the line breakers. We were both excited to try the new spider wire. We put the little boat in the water, and I cruised up directly to the spot where we had our lines broken. I shut the trolling motor off, and we coasted into our spot. "Drop the anchor," I advised Leroy. "Let's just sit right here and see if we can hook one of those big ones." After Leroy dropped the anchor, we began fishing. It wasn't very long at all before the action began. "I've got one," Leroy announced suddenly. I turned my chair around so that I could see him. Leroy definitely had a big one on because his rod had a big old bow in it. The fish was pulling really hard. Leroy's rod suddenly went to the right. The fish was making for the dense moss, just like all the other times. "Oh, no, you don't," Leroy exclaimed, and he reared back in his chair, pulling harder on the fish. "Keep him out of that moss," I added. "I'm trying," Leroy grunted. His rod was really throbbing. It was obvious that the fish was struggling mightily. Suddenly, Leroy's line went slack. "Oh, no," Leroy dropped his arms. "He got off." "Surely it didn't break that spider wire," I mused. Leroy reeled his line in. When the end came out of the water, I didn't see a lure on it. Leroy grabbed the loose end and looked at it. "What the hell?" Leroy said as he looked at it. "What?" I asked him. "It straightened out my swivel." Leroy held it up for me to see. I reached out and grabbed it. Leroy had a little brass swivel tied on, and sure enough, it was straightened out. The fish had pulled hard enough to pull the wire out of the keeper. "Wow," I said with wonder. "That was a big one." "No kidding," Leroy agreed. "I couldn't stop him." "You know," I stated slowly, "I hate those swivels. Tying directly to the lure is the best. If I do use a swivel, I use one of those black ones that have a little dog leg in the end to keep it from pulling out of the keepers like that." I tossed the end back towards Leroy. "Well, I don't have any of those," Leroy told me. "The only reason I have this one is because tying a knot with this braided line is a pain. I figure it would be a lot easier when I change lures." I dug around in my little tackle box that I had on the boat. "Here's one." I handed it to him. Leroy looked it over. "Never seen one of these," he remarked as he cut the old swivel off and he proceeded to tie the new swivel on. "They work better," I said as I turned my chair around and started fishing again. Well, after a few more casts, I caught a nice little bass, weighed around 2 pounds. On my very next cast, I caught another bass about the same size. Soon, Leroy was fishing again, and we both caught a few little bass. The big ones, the line breakers and swivel straighteners, they did not hit us again. At one point, Leroy had a fish on. I turned around and saw it was another 2-pound fish, and after seeing it was not one of those elusive big ones, I turned back around and resumed fishing. I could hear that Leroy had the fish up to his boat. "Hey," Leroy said loudly. I turned around. My first thought was his fish was bigger than either of us had realized. But I saw that he had a 2-pound fish in one hand and his rod in the other hand. "What?" I asked him. Leroy wasn't even looking at his fish. Instead, he was looking towards the bank. "There was someone looking at us," Leroy stated. His eyes never left the shoreline. "What?" I raked my eyes up and down the cattails. "Where?" "Right there," Leroy pointed with his rod. I looked where he was pointing. "I don't see anyone," I told him. "Who was it?" "I don't know who it was," Leroy said, and he flipped his fish back into the water. "But they were right there," he pointed with his rod again. All I saw was cattails. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I asked him. "I'm telling you," Leroy was adamant. "I saw someone right there. Well, all I saw was a face, but they were right there." He was still pointing with his rod. "All you saw was a face?" I asked him. "Well, I bent down to grab that fish," Leroy explained. "When I sat back up, I saw a face right over there. Only saw a face. The cattails were parted like someone was holding them apart, and they had their face out there looking at us. When they saw me looking at them, they ducked back into the cattails." "Was it a man or a woman?" I asked him. "Well, I couldn't tell," Leroy admitted, "but it was dark." "Dark?" I was confused. What's that mean?" "The face was dark." "Dark?" I asked him again. "You mean like black or brown?" "Yeah," Leroy confirmed. "Well, that's weird," I said as I looked closer at the line of cattails. "Could it have been a horse or a cow?" "Maybe," Leroy thought it over, "but I don't think so." "Why not?" I asked him. "Because it looked flat," Leroy told me, "and I didn't see any ears sticking up." "Well, that's odd," I mused. "Did you see hands?" "Hands?" Leroy looked at me funny. "Yeah, hands. You said the cattails were parted. Did you see hands holding them apart?" "Maybe," Leroy said. "I'm not sure. I saw the dark face for sure, though." Suddenly, we both jumped because something, a big rock probably, hit the water about 10 feet from the boat with a big splash. "What the hell?" I said loudly. "That's it," Leroy blurted. He stood up suddenly in the little boat. I had to try to keep the boat steady, because that little boat was definitely not made to stand up in. It was rocking quite a bit, but Leroy was oblivious, with furious. He shook a fist at the cattails where he'd seen that large face. "Hey," Leroy yelled, "you better cut it out, asshole." The little boat rocked quite a bit then. It rocked so much that Leroy almost fell overboard. He caught his balance and he sat back down heavily. Another rock hit the water with a big splash. A split second before the rock hit the water, I saw it. The rock looked to be roughly the size of a baseball. "Where are they coming from?" Leroy asked me. "I'm not sure," I admitted. Both of us were looking around wildly. "From up on the bluff, maybe?" Leroy pointed with his rod again. "I saw that last one," I told him. "I think it came from that direction." I pointed with my own fishing rod, and I pointed at a spot just left of the bluff. The bluff there sloped down towards the water away from us and behind some cattails that were at least 7 feet tall. "Did you see who threw it?" Leroy asked me. "No," I replied. "I just saw the rock right before it hit the water." "I'm not sure, but I think it came from over that way." I pointed with my rod towards the bluff and the cattails again. "How big was it?" "Well, about the size of my fist, or a baseball," I answered. "Pull up the anchor and I'll move us out of range." Leroy put his fishing rod into the little trough on the boat that was made to hold fishing rods. He bent over at the front of the boat and began pulling on the anchor rope. "It's stuck," I could hear him grunting with effort. From my point of view, which was toward the front of the little boat and Leroy's back, I saw in the air another big rock coming our way. The trajectory of the rock showed it came from a right and in front of us, right near where I had thought the rock came from, back where the bluff sloped down to the water and behind the cattails. When I caught sight of the rock in flight, it was on a downward trajectory. "Look out," I yelled just before the rock hit the water with a huge splash. The rock landed close enough to get Leroy wet. The rock looked a lot bigger than the previous one. It had to be heavy. I judged the distance to be around 50 yards from launching point to splashdown. It may have been more. It was hard to judge accurately because of the cattails. Whoever threw that rock had a major league caliber arm. "I can't get it loose." Leroy sat up and turned his chair to look at me. "It must be stuck in a tree down there." "Cut the rope," I told him. Leroy fidgeted around, got out his pocket knife. He opened his knife and bent down to saw the anchor rope. I kept my eyes on the area I thought rocks were coming from. I didn't see any more flying. "Got it," Leroy announced, and he sat back up and back against the back of his chair. I got the trolling motor going and spun the boat to our left. Once the boat turned, I kicked the motor on higher and we sped away. As we moved by, I saw the end of the anchor rope just under the water's surface. The rope was sinking. We heard a big splash of another rock hit the water behind us. That was when we heard it. Laughter. The rock thrower was laughing at us. The laughter was weird sounding. It sounded like a cross between the Wicked Witch of the West and a hyena. The laughter made the hair on my neck stand up. "Who the hell is that?" Leroy muttered as he craned his neck to look back. More like, what the hell was that, I was thinking. The laughter didn't sound human to me. It sounded human-like, if that makes any kind of sense. If that laughter came from a person, that person has to be nuts. The laughter lowered in volume and faded away to silence. When I thought we had enough distance to be safe from thrown rocks, I spun that little boat around and turned off the trolling motor. As the boat drifted, Leroy and I both stared intently back in the direction we thought the rocks and the laughter had originated from. "No one is supposed to be in here," Leroy stated. "Well, how'd he get over there?" I asked Leroy. "There's not really a way over there," Leroy shook his head, "except on foot or horseback. To drive in, you would have to go way over and way back. There are only 3 gates, and all those gates are locked. It would take you hours to drive it, and there is no road. What roads there are short. They just run from the gates down to the windmills." Leroy swept an arm in a big circle, approximating the route. This part of the ranch was nothing but hills and canyons. Leroy and I sat there in the drifting boat. We both looked at the hills beyond the pond, wondering how the rock thrower had even accessed the area. It was then that we heard the splashing. The splashing came from our right and behind us. We both turned to look in that direction. We could see the water was being disturbed in the area where the feeder creek made its way to the pond. The creek made a bend just beyond. The tall cattails were moving. Someone or something had just crossed the creek and was pushing through the cattails. Neither of us actually saw anyone or anything. The cattails gradually stopped waving. Whatever it was had moved behind the cattails on the opposite side. The laughter came again, and it was from that area. Insane cackling mixed with animalistic hyena-like laughter. "Let's get the hell out of here," Leroy said loudly. I agreed and kicked the trolling motor on. The little boat moved away. As I turned to head for the pickup, I turned the speed setting on the trolling motor all the way up. This weird, cackling, hyena-like laughter echoed behind us. As I neared the shore by the pickup, I did not throttle down the trolling motor. Just when I thought the prop might hit bottom, I shut it off and folded it up. The little boat's momentum carried us halfway up onto the bank. We both jumped out and grabbed the boat by its carrying handles and lifted it. We carried it the short distance to the pickup and slid the boat into the bed. Leroy and I both grabbed a bungee strap and quickly tied down the boat chairs so that they couldn't blow out. We then jumped into the cab of the pickup. I started the truck and we started up that steep hill. We were both looking to our right and down at the pond, trying to catch sight of the laughing rock thrower. We had both windows down. We didn't see a thing, but we heard it again. We were halfway up the hill when that laughter came again. I stomped on the accelerator pedal and that pickup lurched forward. We heard a sliding noise and then a bang. I stopped the pickup. Leroy and I looked at each other. "Oh, shit," I said as I put the pickup in park and we both got out of the cab. My pickup had a plastic bed liner in it. The bed liner was always a little slick. When I had hit the gas pedal, the little boat slid out of the truck bed. The little bass boat sat on the road behind us. In our hurry to leave, we had neglected to tie the boat in the truck. There didn't seem to be any damage to the boat that mattered. The outer shell was scuffed up some from hitting the dirt road. The shaft and the propeller of the trolling motor were undamaged. We grabbed the boat and put it in the pickup bed again. This time we tied it in securely. All the while we kept our eyes and ears open, but we heard and we saw nothing. The ride back to Leroy's house was quiet for about half the trip. "And what the hell was that?" Leroy finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Kind of sounded like a hyena." "Hyenas don't throw rocks," Leroy stated. "Nope," I agreed. "Sounded like a witch," Leroy said. I agreed, but neither of us really knew what a laughing witch sounded like. "A witch with one hell of an arm," I said, and we both chuckled. It was almost a full month later before Leroy and I mustered up the courage to go back to that pond. Leroy brought a rifle along. I took a pistol just in case. No rocks were thrown at us and we didn't hear the laughter. We never got one of the line-breaking, swivel-straightening big fish landed either.